When Gregor Samsa woke one morning from troubled dreams, he found himself transformed right there in his bed into some sort of monstrous insect. The opening line of Franz Kafka's The Metamorphosis is one of the great opening lines in all of anything. The main character, as the opening line says, wakes up one morning and finds out that he's been turned into this bug. He doesn't know why or how it happened, but he does know that it happened. And right away, we're introduced to one of the main themes of the story, which is change. How things stay the same or how they change over time. And we can all imagine this happening. What if I woke up one morning and became someone or something else? Some of us may have had this dream before, and usually we wake up and stop dreaming. But for some, and maybe all of us eventually, that's a nightmare that's real. Eventually, we will all become something else, whether it's aging, changing relationships, trauma, different situations regarding physical and mental health, changes to the environment around us that change us personally. We all change. Think about you 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago. That person from 30 years ago may feel continuous, but perhaps a closer inspection would yield someone or something unrecognizable to us now. When is you not you? I think it's fair to say that this theme of change is certainly one of the main ideas in The Metamorphosis by Franz Kafka. But there's also a lot of interesting stuff about philosophy and human nature that I think we can apply to our own personal lives. So if you haven't read The Metamorphosis, I definitely recommend it. It's relatively short, a bit longer than a short story and a bit shorter than a long novella, but definitely easy to digest in a day or two. And I think you should give it a read either before listening to this or shortly afterward. At any rate, the story picks up in the immediate aftermath of Gregor waking up to find out that he's turned into this hideous bug. So immediately he begins to wonder what in the world has happened to me. He takes stock of the situation. Initially, he thinks it might be a dream and he tries to go back to sleep. But upon trying to shift positions in the bed and roll over onto his side, he realizes that he can't because he's a bug. And right away, Kafka introduces us to this idea of the mundanity of it all. Gregor is describing his situation as a bug, basically like someone would describe waking up in the morning with a sore back or a stiff neck. And much like many of us would wake up in the morning after a long night or a difficult work week, Gregor chalks up his new situation as a result of all the work he's been doing. He chalks it up to his profession as a traveling salesman, where he spends a lot of time on the road and he works long hours and the pressure in his job is high. He feels like he needs to provide money, a living for his family, his mom, his dad, and his sister. Early on, he says, quote, "Good Lord, what an exhausting profession I've chosen. Day in and day out on the road. Work like this is far more unsettling than business conducted at home. And then I have the agony of traveling itself to contend with, worrying about train connections, the irregular, unpalatable meals, and human intercourse that is constantly changing, never developing the least constancy or warmth. Devil take it all," end quote. So much like Gregor is describing his job in a sort of ordinary, boring, mundane way, he also is describing his absurd situation of being turned into an insect in a mundane and regular and boring way. And these things sort of combine. So he's sitting there in bed. He can't really move or get up because he doesn't know how to work his body as an insect yet. But instead of being worried about being a bug, he's worried about missing the train and he's worried about missing work. Despite the absurd situation, he's worried about the day-to-day regular things that are going to be impacted by his new situation and by his change. But perhaps the biggest thing that he's worried about, the thing that might impact him the most, is when he realizes that his voice is now screwed up. He can only speak bug language, and he can't really communicate with anyone in his family. This inability to communicate is actually a somewhat horrifying thing when you think about it. Kafka says, quote, Gregor flinched when he heard his own in response. It was unmistakably his old voice, but now it had been infiltrated as if from below by a tortured peeping sound that was impossible to suppress, leaving each word intact, comprehensible, but only for an instant, before so completely annihilating it as it continued to reverberate that a person could not tell for sure whether his ears were deceiving him. End quote. Now, as each of these horrible dominoes continues to fall and Gregor realizes what a terrible predicament he's in, he doesn't really spend a lot of time asking the question of why. There's not a lot of reflection or contemplation or perspective seeking as far as what got him here. In fact, he's actively avoiding this, still thinking that this is going to be something that he can easily fix on his way to work. Kafka continues describing the situation for Gregor. Quote, first, he would get up calmly and undisturbed. He would get dressed and, above all, have breakfast. And only then would he consider his next steps. For all these supine contemplations, he suddenly realized, would yield no useful results. He recalled often having felt mild aches and pains in bed, caused perhaps by lying in an awkward position. And this pain had then proven to be a figment of his imagination the moment he got up. He was curious to see how this morning's imaginings would gradually fade. The change in his voice was nothing more than the harbinger of a proper head cold, an occasional occupational hazard among traveling salesmen. This he doubted not in the least. End quote. So Gregor's sort of perfunctory, regular, ordinary interpretation of this crazy event is continuing here. And as the reader, you wonder if Kafka is making a point here, that perhaps Gregor's life as a traveling salesman, where he's only really concerned with money and getting up and going to work and doing his job and lather, rinse, repeat, do the same thing every day, if this lifestyle that has a lack of reflection, a lack of larger contemplation of philosophy and meaning and maybe even spirituality, you wonder if Kafka is saying that a lack of all of this is ultimately what turned him into this monster. I think it's a question worth thinking about really as you read the whole story, because there could be lots of interpretations of why he turned into a bug. And as the ordeal to get himself out of bed and the logistics of it continue early in the story, another explanation for why or how Gregor turned this way could be his sort of boring lifestyle and his refusal to take risks. And it fits with this theme of doing the ordinary, the regular day-to-day automatic processes that have emerged as a theme here. There's a section where Gregor thinks about this. Quote, simultaneously, though, he continued to remind himself that calm consideration, indeed the calmest consideration, was far preferable to resolutions seized on in despair. At such moments, he fixed his eyes as sharply as possible on the window. But regrettably, the view of the morning fog, which veiled even the far side of the narrow street, offered little by way of optimism and good spirits. End quote. So perhaps this boring life has led him to the foggy window, which symbolizes a lack of hope, where there's no optimism for the future. There's no place where he can be who he is now, unencumbered. And Kafka says, quote, for a little while he lay there quietly, his breathing shallow, and the expectation, perhaps, that this perfect silence might possibly restore the real and ordinary state of things. End quote. But as Gregor is going to find out, unfortunately, silence in this case won't move mountains, it won't turn back the clocks, and it won't cure a monster. Meanwhile, Gregor's struggle to get out of bed continues, and At this point, now he's actually more concerned about worrying others and potentially alarming his family than he is about his own health or safety. I want to highlight a section of the story here that highlights this idea of Gregor's connection to other people and his relationships. This idea is emerging that ultimately Gregor is defining himself only in relation to others and not defining himself in himself and for himself. As we said, he's now more worried about what his family is going to think than he is about his own health. You wonder if this is something that has been going on for a long time, but you also wonder if Gregor is going out of his way to help people, but not getting the same help in return. This idea of compassion is going to be important for the story, and the question of why Gregor doesn't get more help is worth asking. So here's the section I'm talking about. Kafka says, quote, "By the time Gregor was already protruding halfway out of bed, this new method was more a game than a struggle. All he had to do was keep rocking side to side a little at a time. It occurred to him how simple things would be if only someone came to his aid. Two strong individuals, he was thinking of his father and the maidservant, would suffice. All they'd have to do was slip their arms beneath his curved back to scoop him out of bed, then crouch down with their burden and wait patiently for him to flip himself over onto the floor, where he hoped those tiny legs of his would take on some meaning. But even aside from the fact that the doors were locked, should he really call for help? Despite his distress, he couldn't help smiling at the thought." End quote. At this point in the story, the family hasn't seen what he is yet. They're still outside the room locked out. They're concerned and they're calling into him, but of course he can't speak human language, so he can't respond. But here he's thinking about, if he could, how easy it would be for his family to help him, how easy compassion would be if people were willing to help. All they'd have to do is come in, pick him up, and flip him over. But again, he's a bug, so he can't ask for help. And as we just saw from that passage, it's not clear if he actually wants to ask for help. So here we see sort of the two sides of compassion. You have to be willing to ask for help, and we know how difficult that is. But you also have to be able to ask for help, and sometimes that's not possible, as is the case with Gregor here. And then, sadly, on the flip side, you have to have people who are willing to help you. Right now, Gregor's family doesn't know the full extent of what happened to him, but as we're going to find out very shortly, the family is going to be less than ideally helpful, I guess we'll put it that way. So on top of being able to ask for help, being willing to ask for help, you also have to be helped. And although compassion is so easy, again, all they'd have to do is come and pick them up and flip them over. How often is the suffering of the world ignored so that we can go about our daily lives and not be inconvenienced? I think this is another emerging theme of the story, this idea of convenience being valued over compassion. And I think this is a very modern thought that we could apply to our modern world very easily. Back to the story now. Gregor is still in bed trying to get up, and ultimately it's his agitation and his worry about being late to work, and also eventually his boss shows up in his apartment. Obviously this causes Gregor to panic, but eventually because he's so agitated, he just crashes out of bed. And I think it's interesting to note that ultimately it's not Gregor's innate resolution or some strategy he devised. It's certainly not compassion that others show to him. None of these things are the things that get him out of bed. What gets him out of bed is simply his anxiety and his distress about his work situation and, again, sort of the day-to-day inconveniences of life. So I think, again, we're seeing here this idea of maybe Kafka saying something about the modern world and how we're valuing work and money and things, perhaps at the detriment to thinking about finding meaning or purpose or happiness. Speaking of purpose and meaning and happiness, eventually it's revealed that Gregor enjoys woodworking, or at least he did as a hobby. He often references the picture frame that's next to his bed with a picture, I think it's of a woman he cut out of a magazine, but this picture and the picture frame supposedly that he made as a hobby is something that gets referenced a lot in the story. And it might represent the tiny sliver of happiness or meaning or individual hobby that Gregor had in his past life. And oftentimes he's trying to cling on to that picture frame and maintain it, but it's such a small item in what eventually is going to become the clutter of his room and of his life. So as we said, Gregor's boss shows up somewhat hilariously after like a few hours of Gregor not showing up to work. His boss is in his house knocking on his bedroom door, and here is the general manager or the boss talking to Gregor, trying to get him out of his room. He says, quote, "What has come over you? You barricade yourself in your room. You reply to queries only with yes and no. You cause your parents onerous, unnecessary worries, and you are neglecting, let me permit myself to note, your professional responsibilities in a truly unprecedented manner. I speak here in the name of your parents, as well as your employer, and in all seriousness must ask you for a clear and immediate explanation. I am astonished, utterly astonished. I have always known you as a calm, sensible person, and now it seems you've begun to permit yourself the most whimsical extravagances. To be sure, the boss did suggest one possible explanation for your absence this morning. It concerns the cash payments recently entrusted to your care. And truthfully, I all but gave him my word of honor that this explanation could not be correct. But confronted here with your incomprehensible obstinacy, I find myself losing any desire I might have had to come to your defense. And your position is anything but secure. It was originally my intention to discuss all this with you in a private conversation, but since you compel me to waste my time here, I do not know why your esteemed parents should not hear of it as well. In short, your productivity of late has been highly unsatisfactory. Admittedly, this is not the best season for drumming up business. We do acknowledge this, but a season in which no business at all is drummed up is something that does not, and indeed may not exist, ere Samsa." End quote. Now, presumably, Gregor has been a loyal and productive employee for years as a traveling salesman here, and there's one morning where Gregor is a few hours late, then his boss is in his room, going crazy, banging on the door, essentially throwing a temper tantrum. He's not just accusing Gregor of being lazy and incompetent and really screwing over his parents by sleeping in. He's also now saying that Gregor's entire body of work has been subpar, and he's actually also accusing Gregor of stealing money. Again, he's immediately assuming the worst of Gregor after one incident, one late morning. And you wonder if Kafka is saying something about human nature here. And I'm sure a lot of us have probably experienced something like this. And it's when one inconvenience happens to someone, when you make one mistake, or when someone you've gotten along with well gets inconvenienced by you one time, and it's not even intentional, sometimes people freak out. And that reaction always makes it even more disappointing, and sometimes it even damages the relationship between two people. Or maybe it just makes clear what the relationship was to that other person, and now it's just something that's sadly being revealed to you. So Gregor is trying to explain himself. Again, he can't talk, but in his inner monologue, he's again thinking of his situation in terms of how others perceive him. And he thinks that if he goes out there and he reveals himself as a bug, and if they're horrified, then at least he can rest easy knowing that he's not responsible for anything anymore. If they accept that he's a bug, then good, because now he can make it to work on the next train, as if he wasn't an insect. And the way Kafka describes this, it is a little bit funny, and there is this sort of dark humor that pervades the story. We know that tragedy can often be a source of comedy, and this idea of poking fun at the absurd, I think, is something that Kafka is doing here intentionally. There's another moment where you're not really sure, is this supposed to be horrifying or is this supposed to be funny? And it's when Gregor finally is able to maneuver his bug body and open the door. He reveals himself as a bug. Everybody freaks out. His mom faints. People are running away. Stuff is breaking on the floor. His boss basically just takes off out of the apartment, running down the stairs as fast as he can. And hilariously, Gregor thinks to himself that he's the only one in this situation to, quote, maintain his composure, end quote. He's trying to explain himself. He can't. The boss flees. His mother is horrified. And the dad is trying to drive him back into his room. And because Gregor hasn't really mastered locomotion, as he says, he can't move backwards very well. So he's trying to turn around, and he can't. And he's trying to squeeze through the door back into his room. But as he's doing it, he's getting scraped and he's getting hurt. And as he's cramming himself back into his room, he's now wounded and alone. And everything and everyone that he was working with or toward or for has now either turned and fled from him or is actively fighting against him. And part one ends with the father shutting him in the room. And these themes of loneliness and isolation and a lack of acceptance are beginning to show themselves. Kafka ends part one by saying, quote, "Then his father administered a powerful shove from behind, a genuinely liberating thrust that sent him flying, bleeding profusely, into the far reaches of his room. The door was banged shut with the stick, and then at last, all was still," end quote. In the next episode, we will explore these themes of loneliness, isolation, and more in part 2 of The Metamorphosis.